Jason Williams had built his thriving diner chain, Silver Spoon Diners, from the ground up. Over the past decade, he had expanded the business from a single location to now include 13 successful branches across the state. Known for his hands-on leadership style, Jason prided himself on cultivating a warm, family-friendly atmosphere. He believed that a happy staff made for happy customers, and that philosophy was what had fueled the diner's success. However, recently, something felt off. Customer complaints had been piling up. Reviews on social media spoke of rude waitstaffs, long waits, and poor customer service. Employees were leaving faster than he could replace them, and those that stayed often seemed unhappy. Jason's regional managers assured him everything was fine, but the disconnect between the upbeat reports and the whispers of dissatisfaction gnawed at him. Determined to uncover the truth, Jason made the decision to go undercover at one of his locations. He chose the diner, located in a suburban town 2 hours away from his corporate office, far enough that no one would recognize him. The staff at this diner had never met him in person, which gave him a unique advantage to blend in even further. Jason grew out a scruffy beard, swapped his expensive suits for a worn hoodie and jeans, and put on a pair of thick-rimmed glasses. In this guise, he would be just another customer, hopefully revealing what was really happening behind the scenes. He arrived at the diner at lunchtime. The place was bustling with activity. Chatter filled the air, and the clinking of dishes echoed through the space. The dining area was clean, but it was clear the restaurant was starting to show its age. The booths were slightly worn, and the decor felt outdated. Still, it was nothing that couldn't be fixed, Jason thought. But it wasn't the welcoming space he had originally envisioned when he started the company. As he stood by the door, a young waitress with tired eyes approached him. Her name tag read, Samantha. She greeted him with a smile, though her expression seemed strained. "Hi there. Welcome. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Samantha asked, her voice cheerful but strained. Jason noticed the faint bags under her eyes and the hesitation in her smile. Something about her seemed off, but he brushed it aside. He had an agenda, and he wasn't going to let his suspicions cloud his observations just yet. "Just coffee. Thanks," Jason said, sliding into a booth near the window. Samantha nodded and hurried off to grab the coffee, weaving between the tables with practiced efficiency as she moved through the crowded diner. Jason noticed how overworked she seemed. She was constantly juggling multiple tasks, refilling drinks, picking up plates, delivering food, without showing any signs of frustration in front of the customers. The kind of behavior Jason valued in his employees, but it was clear she had reached her limit. When she returned with his coffee, Jason placed his order for a burger and fries. As she scribbled it down on her notepad, a man's voice boomed from the kitchen. "Samantha, what's taking so long? You're falling behind again." The voice belonged to a short, stocky man in his 40s. Wearing a stained apron, Jason guessed he was the shift manager, but he hadn't introduced himself yet, which was something Jason took note of. Samantha flinched at the tone, but she nodded quickly. "I'm coming right up," she called back, her voice cracking slightly. Jason frowned. He had built this business on the idea that employees should feel valued, not berated in front of customers. This wasn't the kind of environment he had worked so hard to foster. As he waited for his food, Jason overheard snippets of conversation from other tables. A family at the booth behind him complained about waiting too long for their meals, and a pair of teenagers whispered about how rude the manager had been to their waitress earlier. The atmosphere in the diner felt tense, and Jason felt a growing sense of unease. When Samantha returned with his burger, she apologized quietly. "Sorry about the wait," she said, her voice soft. Avoiding eye contact, Jason smiled reassuringly. "No worries, you're doing great," he said, but he noticed that her eyes flickered up to meet his. For a split second, surprised by the kindness in his voice, she nodded quickly and hurried off to the next table. Jason had barely taken a bite when he heard muffled sobbing coming from the kitchen. His fork froze halfway to his mouth. The sound grew louder, unmistakable now. It was Samantha. His stomach turned. "I'm trying my best." "Okay." Samantha's voice cracked through the thin walls of the kitchen. "I haven't had a break in 6 hours, and I'm doing everything I can." The manager's voice cut in, dismissive and sharp. "If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you're in the wrong job. We don't have time for excuses." Jason's chest tightened. He set his fork down and stood up. walking toward the kitchen door. What he saw inside made his heart race. Samantha was standing with trembling hands, wiping her eyes with the back of her sleeve. The manager loomed over her, arms crossed, his face twisted in frustration. Two cooks, who seemed equally uncomfortable, avoided looking at the scene, unwilling to intervene. Jason clenched his fists, his heart pounding. This was not the company he had built. "Is there a problem here?" Jason asked, his voice calm but firm. The manager turned, startled. No, just a little miscommunication," he said quickly, his tone defensive. Samantha shook her head, her tears still pooling in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jason looked at her for a moment, then turned back to the manager. He didn't reveal who he was yet, but his voice was firm. "She looks like she needs a break. Why don't you let her sit down for a few minutes?" The manager scoffed. "We're short-staffed? There's no time for breaks during the rush." Jason's jaw tightened. "There's always time to treat people with respect," he said evenly, his gaze steady as he held the manager's eyes. The tension in the room was thick, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Jason knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. The manager's lips pressed into a thin line, but before he could respond, one of the cooks, a wiry young man with a nervous energy, spoke up. "Megan's been nonstop since she clocked in. She hasn't even had time to grab a drink of water," he said, his voice hesitant, but carrying a quiet defiance. The manager shot him a glare. "Stay out of it. Connor, focus on your station." Jason looked at Connor for a moment, then turned his gaze back to the manager. "And who's in charge of making sure your team can focus?" he asked. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like the pressure is coming from how this place is being run." The manager's face flushed, and his bravado slipped for a moment. "Look, I'm just doing my job. If people can't handle it, that's not on me." Jason's voice grew firmer. "We'll see about that." Megan was still wiping her eyes as she looked up at Jason, her confusion mixed with a hint of gratitude. "I'll be fine," she muttered, her voice wavering. She turned toward the door, but Jason gently stopped her. "Take 5, he said softly. "You've earned it." The manager started to protest, but Jason held up a hand, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She's taking a break now." Megan hesitated, glancing nervously between Jason and the manager, but then she nodded and slipped past the swinging kitchen doors. Jason turned his attention back to the manager. His voice was calm, but his words were laced with authority. "What's your name?" "Rick," the manager replied, his voice defensive. "And who are you to come in here and tell me how to run my shift?" Rick snapped. Jason ignored the question. "How long have you been the manager here?" Rick folded his arms. "About 2 years, and I've kept this place running just fine. So I don't need some random customer stepping in." Jason's voice rose slightly, his frustration clear. "You call this fine? Your staff is overworked. Your customers are complaining, and you're berating people in the middle of their shifts. This is a mess." Rick opened his mouth to argue, but Jason cut him off. "You might want to think about how you're treating people, because I guarantee if I were your boss, this wouldn't fly." Rick's face paled slightly, but he quickly tried to mask it with a scoff. "Right. Well, you're not my boss. So..." Before Rick could finish, the kitchen doors swung open. Megan reappeared, her face slightly more composed. Though her exhaustion was evident, she kept her head down as she walked past Rick and back toward the dining area. Jason took a deep breath and gave Rick one last pointed look before turning and following Megan back into the dining room. As Jason walked back into the dining area, the atmosphere had already shifted slightly. The usual hustle and bustle of lunchtime had started to settle down, but the energy in the diner felt different. Megan had returned to her station, moving more slowly now, her exhaustion more apparent than before, but still managing a small smile for every customer she served. Jason watched her carefully, noting how her movements had become mechanical. Efficient but devoid of the enthusiasm she had likely once had. Her smile, though polite, seemed strained, as though it had become a mask she wore just to get through the day. Jason noticed that Rick was in the kitchen, glaring at her through the service window, his eyes narrowed with irritation. The tension between them was palpable, and it was clear that whatever small victory Jason had won earlier in the office had barely scratched the surface. Rick had barely acknowledged Megan's return and was focused instead on barking orders at Connor, the young cook who had quietly stepped up to defend Megan earlier. The entire dynamic in the kitchen was off, and Jason felt his frustration rise again. He took out his phone, discreetly jotting down notes as he observed. He wrote down everything he had witnessed: Rick's behavior, Megan's unrelenting workload, the customer complaints, and even Connor's quiet, but palpable sense of responsibility. He had seen enough. It was clear that something had to change. This was no longer just about improving service or speed. It was about the heart of the diner, the people who worked there, and how they were treated. The food arrived shortly after, and Jason continued to observe without intervening. The conversations around the diner were punctuated by the clinking of silverware, but the atmosphere had shifted. Patrons who had once been patient were now glancing over at the kitchen, where Rick's voice could still be heard, rising above the low hum of the restaurant. His constant barking orders, his dismissive tone toward the staff, and the way he treated everyone around him created a palpable tension that infected the entire space. Jason finished his meal quietly, his mind running through the next steps. He hadn't just come here to observe. He had come here to take action. After Megan delivered the check, he asked for it casually, keeping his tone light and friendly. "Can I get the check, please?" he asked. Megan nodded. And a few moments later, she returned with the bill, quietly placing it in front of him. "Sorry again about earlier," she murmured. "I hope everything was okay." Jason smiled gently, trying to reassure her. "No need to apologize," he said. "You're doing great." He slipped some cash into the billfold. "You've been working hard, and I noticed." Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she offered a small, genuine smile. For the first time during his visit, Jason saw a flicker of light in her eyes, a small spark of appreciation. She nodded silently, before hurrying off to take care of another table. Jason took a deep breath and stood up. He wasn't done here, not by a long shot. He walked toward the door, his mind already racing through his plans. As he stepped outside, he pulled out his phone. "Janet," he said, when his assistant picked up, "clear my schedule for tomorrow, and get me everything we have on the staff at the suburban diner location. I want employee files, performance reviews, all of it. I need a full report on what's going on there." "Got it," Janet replied without hesitation. "Anything else?" Jason glanced back at the diner one last time, his thoughts solidifying into a firm plan. "Yeah, make sure my regional managers are ready for a meeting. We need to talk." He hung up, slid his phone into his pocket, and got into his car, his thoughts already running ahead to what needed to be done. Tomorrow, he wasn't just going to observe, he was going to act. The next morning, Jason arrived back at the diner just after opening. He was once again dressed in his scruffy disguise, hoodie, jeans, thick glasses. He carried a small notebook in his pocket, and this time, he had a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't here to sit on the sidelines and take notes. Today, he was going to get to the bottom of things. The morning shift was quieter than the hectic lunchtime rush, giving Jason a chance to observe without all the distractions. Megan was already on the floor, moving a little slower than the day before. Jason could see the exhaustion in her movements, her smile thinner than it had been on her first day. Rick wasn't in sight yet, but Connor was in the kitchen, prepping ingredients. Jason sat back, watching, waiting for the right moment to speak. After a few minutes, he saw Megan passing by with a coffee pot. So he called her over. "Megan," he said casually, keeping his tone light. "Do you have a second?" Megan hesitated for a moment, glancing at the sparse crowd in the diner. "Sure, but I can't stay long," she said. "We're short-staffed again." "I won't keep you," Jason promised. "I just wanted to ask, how long have you been working here?" Megan blinked at the question, clearly caught off guard. "About 8 months," she answered, her voice uncertain. "Why?" Jason leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You seem like you're carrying a lot on your shoulders. Is it always this busy?" Megan hesitated, her eyes darting toward the kitchen window. "It's not always the customers," she began, her voice quiet. "Sometimes it's—" She trailed off, biting her lip. Jason nodded, sensing there was more. "It's Rick, isn't it?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with panic. "I shouldn't—" "You don't have to say anything," Jason interrupted gently. "I just want to understand what it's like for you here." Megan hesitated again, then sighed deeply. "It's not just him, it's everything. We're always short-staffed, and when things get hectic, Rick just makes it worse. I know he's under pressure too, but it feels like we're always the ones paying for it." Jason nodded thoughtfully, letting her words sink in. He knew this wasn't just about bad management. It was about a lack of care for the people who made the diner run. He decided to press a little further. "What about Connor? He seems like he tries to help." Megan's expression softened slightly. "Connor's great. He's only been here a few months, but he's one of the few people who actually cares. He covers for people when they're struggling. Honestly, if it weren't for him, I probably would have quit by now." Before Jason could ask anything more, The kitchen door swung open, and Rick walked out. The energy in the room shifted instantly. Megan tensed, quickly excusing herself to refill a customer's coffee. Jason couldn't help but watch as Rick stormed toward Connor, barking orders in a way that was as dismissive as ever. Jason clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. He had seen enough. This was no longer just about improving service. This was about treating people with the respect they deserved. The issues here went far beyond a few complaints. It was a systemic problem with the way the diner was being run, and Rick's leadership was the root cause. Jason decided it was time to act. He watched as the diner picked up pace again, with the usual hustle of customers ordering food and staff moving quickly to meet demand. But there was a crackling tension in the air, one that Jason knew had to be addressed. As the first incident occurred, an older customer complaining about his eggs being overcooked, Jason stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This was where things needed to change. "That's enough," Jason said, his voice firm, cutting through the noise of the diner. Rick turned toward him, his face twisting in annoyance. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he sneered. Jason pulled out his wallet and revealed his company ID, locking eyes with Rick. "I'm Jason Williams," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I own this diner, and 13 others just like it." The room went silent. Megan froze mid-step, her eyes wide. Connor peeked out from the kitchen. Even the customers seemed to hold their breath. Rick's face turned pale before flushing bright red. I didn't realize." "No," Jason interrupted, his voice cutting. "You didn't, because if you had, you wouldn't be treating my staff like this, or my customers." The silence in the diner was deafening. The tension that had built up over the past few hours was now at its peak, and everyone in the room was waiting to see what Jason would do next. He stood there, his eyes locked on Rick, who was still trying to process the shock of realizing that the man he had been so rude to was, in fact, the owner of the diner. Jason didn't give Rick a chance to recover. He took a deep breath and calmly spoke again. "Let's talk in the back," he said firmly, his tone brokering no argument. Rick stood there for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His face was flushed with embarrassment, and his bravado had evaporated completely. For a moment, it seemed like he might argue, but he knew he had no choice. He gave a stiff nod, muttering something under his breath, and walked toward the kitchen. Jason followed him, his steps measured and calm. The kitchen door swung open, and the chaotic sounds of sizzling food, clattering plates, and the hum of the dishwasher met their ears. It was a stark contrast to the stillness that had descended over the rest of the diner. Inside the kitchen, the cooks continued to work, seemingly trying to ignore the tension between their manager and Jason. Connor, who had been working quietly, glanced up but said nothing, his eyes flicking nervously between Rick and Jason. "Close the door," Jason said, his voice low but firm. Rick did as instructed, and the kitchen door clicked shut behind them. The noise of the diner was suddenly muffled, and the space felt smaller, more intimate. This was the moment. Jason wasn't just about to reprimand Rick. He was about to turn the entire situation around. Jason stood tall, his arms crossed, and locked eyes with Rick. "Do you have any idea how out of line you've been?" he asked, his voice steady but full of authority. Rick swallowed hard, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but Jason cut him off before he could say anything. "I've been watching everything. I've seen how you treat your staff, how you treat Megan, how you treat your customers." Jason's voice rose slightly with each word, and he could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "This is not how we operate in my company." Rick opened his mouth again, but Jason didn't let him speak. "You're a manager. You're supposed to lead by example, not by bullying your staff, not by making people feel small, unappreciated, or worthless. I don't care how long you've been here or how stressful your job is. That behavior is unacceptable." Rick's bravado was gone. His shoulders slumped, and he looked down, unable to meet Jason's eyes. For the first time, he seemed small and vulnerable. I didn't mean it to be like that," he muttered, his voice shaking. It's been tough around here. Everyone's been behind, and I don't know how to keep things running smoothly. I thought being tough on them would make them work harder." Jason took a slow breath, trying to control the frustration he felt. "Tough doesn't work. Respect works. You want your staff to be motivated, to do their best. You treat them with respect. You lead by example, and you make sure they know they're valued." Jason's gaze softened just a little. "But you don't berate them. You don't belittle them, not in front of customers, not behind closed doors. Rick was silent, but the weight of Jason's words seemed to be sinking in. Jason knew that he had to make a tough decision, one that would send a clear message about the kind of behavior that was tolerated in his company. Rick, Jason said, his voice hardening once again, I've seen enough. I can't have you working for me anymore. You're done. Rick looked up, his face pale. You're firing me, he asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. Yes, Jason replied firmly, effective immediately. You've created a toxic environment here, and I'm not going to let that slide. I'll have HR process your severance package, but you're not welcome here anymore. Rick stood frozen for a moment, as if trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Finally, he nodded stiffly, his eyes wide with shame, and walked out of the office. Not a single word of protest leaving his lips. Jason watched him leave, his chest tightening. He didn't enjoy firing people, but this wasn't just about Rick's behavior. It was about setting a standard of respect, a standard of care, a standard that Jason was determined to uphold, no matter the cost. When Jason stepped back into the dining area, the change in the atmosphere was palpable. Megan and Connor were standing near the kitchen, their expressions a mix of shock and cautious hope. Jason could feel the weight of their eyes on him as he approached. He gave them both a reassuring smile. Thank you for your patience today, he said, his voice steady, but filled with gratitude. I want to make sure you both know that things are going to change around here. Starting today, Megan and Connor exchanged looks, their skepticism evident, but also tempered by a faint glimmer of hope. Jason continued, First of all, I want to personally apologize for the way things have been run here. I've been too distant, and I've trusted the wrong people to manage my business. That changes today. Megan spoke first, her voice hesitant but hopeful. What do you mean? What's going to change? Jason smiled and leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. I'm bringing in a new manager, someone with experience, but also someone who knows how to lead with respect. He paused. In the meantime, I'm going to personally oversee things here until we get everything back on track. Connor's eyes widened. Wait, you're staying? You're not just leaving it to the new manager. Jason nodded. For as long as it takes. Megan's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight had been lifted. That would be amazing. Jason turned his attention to the staff, letting his words sink in. But that's not all. We're also going to address the staffing issues. No more being short-staffed during peak hours. We are going to hire more people, and I'll make sure that everyone gets proper breaks. You can't take care of customers if you're running on empty. Connor looked visibly relieved. Thank you, he whispered. Jason nodded. You two deserve more than just a pat on the back. Megan, I've seen how hard you've worked and how much you care about the customers and your coworkers. You've earned a significant pay raise, and I'm setting up a bonus system for the staff so that hard work like yours gets recognized. Megan's eyes shimmered. Oh my God, really? Jason smiled warmly. Really? Megan and Connor exchanged surprised glances, but neither of them spoke. For a long moment, they just sat there, absorbing what Jason had said. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of real change. Thank you, Megan whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. Jason nodded. You've earned it. All of it. Over the next few weeks, things began to change. True to his word, Jason stayed at the diner, working alongside the staff and listening to their feedback. He interviewed candidates for the new manager position, ultimately hiring a woman named Denise, whose empathetic leadership style won the respect of the team almost immediately. Jason approved raises for Megan and Connor, bringing in new staff to ease the workload. The atmosphere in the diner shifted dramatically. Customers noticed the difference. The service was faster, more efficient, but the real change was the morale of the staff. They were happier, they were working together, and most importantly, they felt respected. Megan stopped Jason one afternoon just before he was about to leave. I just wanted to say, she said, smiling softly, this place feels different now. Better, like it actually matters. Jason smiled back, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. It does matter, and so do you. As he walked out of the diner that day, Jason felt a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about profits or expansion anymore. It was about the people who made it all possible, and he wasn't going to forget that again.